So we're asking today things like, are the Gospels that tell the story of Jesus the result of many years of Chinese whispers with little relationship to the facts, as many claim in modern scholarship, or are they eyewitness testimonies set down within the lives of those who walked with Jesus? Well, that is the way it is, according to New Testament expert Richard Bauckham, who joins me on the programme today. His book, Jesus and the Eyewitnesses, has more or less revolutionised scholarly study of the Gospels. He's joining me on the programme today in conversation with James Crossley, who's a New Testament scholar. He'll be arguing against some of the conclusions that Richard has drawn in his book, Jesus and the Eyewitnesses. Well, I've been really looking forward to the programme that we're going to be having today, as I'm joined by my guests, Richard Bauckham and James Crossley. They're both New Testament historians. They've both done a lot of work in the area of the Gospels and who they were written by, why they were written, what the context was that they were written into. And we've got a fascinating discussion on the programme today as we specifically look at Richard Bauckham's really increasingly well-known book, Jesus and the Eyewitnesses. And, well, Richard's here in person to tell us a bit about it. James is also here as he engages with Richard during the course of the programme today. So thank you, gentlemen, both for coming into the programme. Great to have you with me.
Thank you.
Perhaps we'll introduce you first, Richard, as a newcomer to the programme. Though I have to say, your name has been mentioned a number of times before in this very studio, as people, when they've come in to talk specifically about New Testament issues, and particularly things like the reliability of the Gospels, your name's cropped up on an increasingly frequent basis. And a lot of it is to do with this book that you've written. But first of all, tell us a little bit of yourself. What's your background, faith-wise, and as far as the way you got into this whole area of discipline?
I'm an Anglican by background, grew up an Anglican. I actually began as a historian. I did a first degree in Cambridge in history. I did a PhD in history in Cambridge. And after that moved into theology and biblical studies. I was 15 years in Manchester teaching historical and contemporary theology. I moved to St Andrews as Professor of New Testament. I was 15 years in St Andrews, and 2 years ago I took early retirement so that I could concentrate on the writing.
And you've kind of caused a bit of a stir, really, in what you have written. I mean, have you kind of gone in with the intention of making big, grand claims that are going to kind of cause a bit of controversy?
No, not really. I think I develop my ideas for my own interest. I'm often more critical of what's out there in the consensus than a lot of people are. I want to test things out for myself. In the case of Jesus and the Eyewitnesses, I had some ideas which I knew would throw a spanner in the works. But I started it intending to write a much shorter book, which would throw these ideas out for people to, give a bit of attention to. I ended up writing a much bigger book because the argument just led me there, and it was a very nice experience of writing in the sense that the argument sort of grew organically, and I just went where the argument took me, and it ended up as a 500-page book, which broke with the consensus in gospel scholarship, I think, a good deal more than I had originally intended when I set out.
And has been afforded the honour of the Ramsey Prize recently.
Yes.
I mean, what does that mean to you to have won that prize?
Well, it is quite a prestigious prize, awarded every 2 years, across the board, theological, religious subjects. So it's an honour. It's also, I think, very good in terms of getting the book known. It's good publicity, in the sense that I think people who may not follow what's coming out in the theological world have their attention drawn to it. And that, I think, is the intention of the prize, really, to highlight something that's worthy of people's attention.
Well, we'll get to the meat of what claims the book essentially makes in a moment, but let's first of all say hello again to James Crossley, who was with us for a couple of programmes back in January. James, great to have you with us again.
Yeah, good to be back again.
Thank you. You're resident in Sheffield, where you teach New Testament history and that sort of thing. You were in earlier in the year to this programme to talk about the book you authored with James Bird. How did early Christianity begin, or how did Christianity begin, was the title. And so you yourself, though, don't actually come from a faith background. I mean, perhaps, I think, as we said before, relatively rare breed in that sense. Most people who are interested in New Testament church history tend to be Christians. But for you, it was really just interest in the subject that attracted you?
Yes, I mean, a series of accidents and things. I mean, I came from a fairly, entirely religious kind of background, and got into New Testament studies through somebody recommending for me to do A-level because I wanted to do ancient history, and it was the nearest thing, and I really stuck with it all the way through university. Enjoyed it immensely, and really there was no other way I was going to go, I don't think, in the long run. And then kept going at PhD at Nottingham, and I've worked at Exeter, and now at Sheffield, where I've been for 5 years teaching biblical studies.
I know that one of your special interest subjects has been Mark, the Gospel of Mark, and that's certainly something that crops up in Jesus and the Eyewitnesses. I mean, obviously all the Gospels are packed with claims to the miraculous. I mean, now, as a non-Christian, does that sort of, in any sense, make a difference, do you think, to the way you look at the text compared to, say, a Christian who might be happy to believe that these miraculous events actually did take place, and so that therefore maybe colours the way they read the text themselves?
I mean, certainly. I mean, I could hardly claim that I read an ancient text, see something miraculous in the text, and think, well, my almost natural instinct is to think not a chance. So there is inevitably that kind of perspective coming through, but you still have to, disprove or prove to the best you can these kinds of things. I mean, and as we've said before, I mean, this is one of the areas where I might disagree with Richard's book, is the implications. Do we have eyewitnesses to miracles? Because this could be this is a revolutionary claim, it seems to me, if you push the logic of Richard's argument.
Well, we'll get into that argument then. And so, really, let me say from the outset, if you haven't read the book, it's well worth picking up. I mean, you can find it on Amazon. I've put a link with this show if you want to click directly through and order a copy of the book. It's a pretty weighty tome, as you said, Richard. You weren't intending on writing such a long book, but I suppose the arguments just continued to fall out of the research you were doing. I mean, fascinating stuff. Just reading one chapter in isolation is a very interesting thing. There was a chapter on the names, the popularity of certain names around the time of Jesus, and you kind of draw out from these correlations, etc., with the Gospels and the number of times certain names are mentioned, the fact that this is good evidence for these Gospels having been produced, written in a certain time period at a certain place. Just fascinating stuff for me, but this is just one of the aspects. Tell us, what is the core, if you like, argument that you're setting forth in Jesus and the Eyewitnesses?
The core argument is very simple, or the core conclusion is very simple. It is that the Gospels, as we have them, the texts of the 4 Gospels in the New Testament, are pretty close to the testimony of the eyewitnesses. I think in one case the Gospel was actually written by an eyewitness, a disciple of Jesus. I think in the other 3 cases we are pretty close to the way the eyewitnesses told their stories. I think some people listening in may find that not in the least surprising, because of course that has been traditional Christian view down the centuries. But it's not been the consensus view, or I should say at least the mainstream view, in New Testament scholarship during the past century at least. So in that sense, it's breaking with a whole lot of scholarly assumptions and methods designed to, as it were, get back behind the Gospels to the real Jesus. And the movement known as form criticism, which started up in the early 20th century, has had a huge impact on New Testament scholarship, which has been waning recently. I mean, I'm not entirely on my own in being dubious about form criticism, but it still has quite a hold over a lot of the ways in which people think, in which scholars instinctively go about working on the Gospels.
Is that then essentially a very, if you like, sceptical view that this could be first-hand information, that this in some way has to be the result of a sort of a Chinese whispers almost effect, stories circulating and changing over time until they finally end up in the way we read them?
The form critics argued that no doubt the eyewitnesses were the first people to tell stories about Jesus or to relate sayings of Jesus. They started the tradition off. But according to the form critics, the traditions then went through a fairly lengthy period of oral transmission in the Christian communities, and all kinds of things could have happened in that period. And they came out of that, as it were, simply as Christian community traditions attributed to the community, not to any individuals like Peter or John or whoever. And the evangelists pick them up at the end of that long oral tradition. Now, it is possible to read that model of the history fairly conservatively. I mean, quite a lot of people have done. They've argued that the early churches preserved these traditions fairly faithfully. The major form critics did not think that. They thought that the traditions were very heavily modified and in many cases created in the oral tradition. And one of the ways they worked was to say, how would a story of this kind, shall we say a miracle story, how would it have functioned in Christian teaching? And they correlated a particular sort of story or saying of Jesus with the functions it would have had, the way people would have used it in preaching and teaching in the church. And their idea was that use had a very strong effect on the way the stories were told or indeed invented. So the model doesn't have to be very radical and sceptical, but it can also be very radical and sceptical.
And so what you're proposing, though, is very much at odds with what has been the predominant way of approaching, if you like, scholarly interpretation of Scripture. And you're saying, actually, form criticism has been overdone, and actually there's a lot going for the Gospels in terms of just reading them as actual eyewitness testimony that hasn't been handed down through lots of oral transmission over years.
Yes, indeed. I mean, a very simple point is that the eyewitnesses were still around for this period that the form critics, correctly, there is a period between, shall we say, the death of Jesus and the earliest written Gospels. But it was a period in which the eyewitnesses were around. A very good case of this, just to sort of introduce the idea, is when Paul in 1 Corinthians 15, that's the earliest account we have of resurrection appearances, and Paul just gives a list of well-known people, disciples of Jesus, to whom Jesus after the resurrection appeared. And he says at one point, and he appeared to over 500 believers, most of whom are still alive. He's writing 20 years after the crucifixion. And that comment, 500, most of whom are still alive, that must imply, check it out with those people, if you doubt it. It must imply that people like that were around in the early churches, they were available. And it also shows, I think, the kind of eyewitnesses that would be available. Because it seems to me you would have some eyewitnesses, like most of those 500, I guess, who are eyewitnesses to one or few incidents in Jesus' story, but you would have others who were kind of with Jesus continuously, someone like the Apostle Peter. So you have sort of minor eyewitnesses who might simply tell the story of their own encounter with Jesus. And then you would have the more official witnesses, the 12 apostles, but others too in that category of sort of disciples of Jesus right through the story.
And you make the case right from the beginning of the book that the fact that in these types of historiographies, having the eyewitnesses still present when they were written down was important. You referenced Papias a lot, and the way that what we have of his writings shows that he saw this as very important, having the testimony of eyewitnesses to hand if he was going to write certain things down. So as far as you're concerned, we need to see what was happening at the time historically and see that this was not just a sort of as much of a random and slightly haphazard affair as many people have kind of assumed in modern day thinking.
Yes. One interesting thing about this, I think, is that ancient historians, people who wrote history in the ancient world, thought that, strictly speaking, you could only write contemporary history. They wrote about the more remote past, but they were entirely dependent on previous historians. If you're going to be a creative historian to tell a new story, it's got to be contemporary, because you've got to be able to contact the eyewitnesses, actually meet the eyewitnesses, quiz them, as it were, so that you get some idea of their reliability and that kind of thing. So direct testimony from the eyewitnesses was the ideal. The ideal, in fact, was that the historian himself should have been an eyewitness and involved in the events. But failing that, he should be in contact with eyewitnesses. So I think that the Gospels, being very obviously contemporary history, that is within the memory of living people, would readers of the Gospels, hearers of the Gospels, would have expected eyewitness testimony to be included in the Gospels. And so they'd be alert for indications of who the eyewitnesses were. And that's, I think, a big point, actually, because part of what I want to argue is the Gospels do have ways of indicating their eyewitness sources, which few people have really recognised. And some people, in response to me, say, these are very vague and ambiguous references, but I think the significance of the references is much increased if you put yourself in the position of the original hearers, who would be expecting eyewitness testimony and would be alert to indications of it.
I mean, for instance, you talk about the story of the road to Emmaus and the fact that only one of the disciples is named, and that seems rather odd. Why would you go to the trouble of naming one but not the other? And you've said in your book that it's actually, when you do get a name, you've got to ask, well, what's going on there? Is that for a particular reason that someone's been named? And in that instance, you would say, this is the eyewitness that the writer was depending on for that particular story.
Exactly, yes. I mean, I think certain eyewitnesses would have been well known in the early church as the people who witnessed this or that story. In that particular case, the man's called Clopas. And you see, there's a phenomenon of names in the Gospels, which I think requires some kind of explanation. One is not surprised that major disciples of Jesus, Mary Magdalene, Peter, should be named. That's not at all surprising. But if you look at the minor characters in the Gospels, the people who just appear in one or two episodes, most of them are anonymous. Most of them do not have names. But then we find a handful of them in each of the Gospels do have names. So why does Luke name Clopas? Why does Luke name Zacchaeus the tax collector? Why does Mark name Simon of Cyrene, the father of Alexander and Rufus? Bartimaeus, again by Mark. Why have we got these few names? And I think really the only suggestion that accounts for pretty much all of these instances, and therefore it's a kind of economic hypothesis, is that these are people who subsequently joined the Christian communities and were well known for telling these stories. I imagine Bartimaeus, as a member of the Jerusalem church, you could hardly stop him telling his story on any possible occasion, and therefore the story came with his name attached to it.
And so for those who were, as you say, in that community reading those stories, these names would have meant something. So they were only being included where there was obviously, meant to be seen as so-and-so who you've probably heard of at some point.
Yes, indeed, or so-and-so whom you've met.
Yeah.
Because another feature of the early churches was there's a great deal of travelling around and movement and so on. So I think one should imagine quite a few of these eyewitnesses cropping up here and there in the early Christian movement and being really quite widely known.
Well, fascinating stuff. Let's bring James in at this point. James, I mean, you've said from the outset that you don't necessarily differ greatly in certain areas of the book to Richard's hypothesis. I mean, how much would you say you do go by this form criticism form of looking at the Gospels and understanding them in that way?
Well, I was actually one of the sceptical people about form criticism Richard alluded to. I've long felt it was never sufficiently explained with reference to cross-cultural data or to ancient historical sources. I was always quite sceptical about form criticism. I mean, in certain cases, I can see how individual stories may have developed and how they may reflect the concerns of the church, certainly. But as an overall kind of grand model for the gospel texts, I'm very sceptical. I was always one of the types of people who was there to be convinced by a theory of eyewitnesses as well, but I came at it from a different angle in many ways, through kind of a classic historical Jesus scholarship approach, where, for example, I did a lot of work on Jesus and the law, where it seemed to me that this material had to be at least very, very early, probably reflecting historical Jesus as far as we can show something like that. For example, if you have a dispute over plucking of the grain in Mark 2:23 through to 28, or hand-washing disputes in Mark 7, I mean, this is the kind of material that's not much relevance at all, it seems to me, to the early church, but exactly the kind of disputes you get in a kind of, let's say, inter-Jewish legal dispute or something like this. So that had to come from somewhere, and as Richard says, there are, Peter and co were around in those decades. So the idea of eyewitnesses seemed very, very appealing to me. So, like I say, I'm as a theory, I think Richard's onto something. I agree with a lot of it. I would happily support most of it. I just can't go the full way. I still think there's maybe a bit more chaos in the gospel traditions and something like John's gospel. But I think as a general model, we all disagree on details and so on. I think it's got a lot going for it.
Yeah, this is more or less preserved fairly well. I mean, perhaps your focus will be on the synoptic gospels, though, Matthew, Mark and Luke.
Yes.
And you would put John in a different category.
Yes.
And this is an area where Richard is perhaps most controversial in his book, and we'll come to that in a moment. But, do you feel then that scholarship is swinging in the direction of Richard? I mean, you obviously are also in a similar camp to Richard, if not agreeing in every aspect. But do you think that there is a bit of a reaction now to this more sceptical form criticism?
That's a very difficult question, I think, at the moment, because if we take a look at this in a historical context, scholarship in historical context, I think Richard's book is a part of I don't mean this negatively or positively. A conservative movement in biblical studies, which is right there in the mainstream at the present. So N.T. Wright's book on the resurrection, Hurtado's book on Lord Jesus Christ. These have become prominent mainstream books, whereas in an era where form criticism was dominant, they were there, but not quite as prominent. But the other thing is there's the alternative reaction. I think there's a hard secularising move in New Testament studies as well. So I think Richard's work will get, time will tell, of course, will get a lot of support in more conservative camps, but the hard secularising world, I could see, reacting against it as well. And you can probably tell by the way I'm phrasing this is that I don't entirely agree that this is necessarily a good thing, that,
right.
Cultural contexts are dictating how we accept results or not. But that's my impression. That's all I can say, really, of how this will go. And but there are exceptions. I consider myself an exception. So I certainly don't consider myself conservative. I have openly healthy secular tendencies in my eyes. But I think it's I think it is a good model.
I mean, is there a bit of a split then between those who are, as it were, in a more conservative, if you like, manner of wanting to look at things? And again, is this a case of bias coming into play? I mean, I know when we last had you on, James, you did feel that the willingness for evangelical scholars to accept the miraculous, the resurrection, and the theories that go around that for its proof, were not warranted, if you like, by just the arguments they put forward. I mean, Richard, does your faith background, as it were, has that been a motivator in driving you towards finding a certain conclusion that the Gospels are eyewitness testimony, that they do have this reliability, which obviously many evangelicals welcome with open arms, as opposed to something like the Jesus Seminar or something? So I mean, does your faith play a part in that?
I mean, it's really very, very hard to know quite what role one's own approach has in determining the conclusions you reach. I mean, clearly one's basic attitude to the religious significance of the material. I think that you can't get away from the fact that the material is of religious significance, and therefore many people who work on it have got some kind of interest in it beyond just an interesting bit of ancient history. I think in the end, it's the arguments that have got to be assessed as arguments. And in a sense, it doesn't really matter where someone comes from. It's the arguments that have got to be assessed. And I think there is a degree of objectivity in New Testament studies, as in most historical work. You can never get pure objectivity, and one shouldn't really imagine that one could. But there's an important degree of objectivity, I think, in the sense of arguments being put out there that anyone coming from any perspective can assess as arguments. And I think we do need to hold on to that, as opposed to, a kind of relaxed postmodern perspective which says, well, everybody's right, really, just how I feel is what counts. I think there are hard issues of arguments that can be discussed. I mean, if I could just go back to the reception the book's had, if you like, for a moment, because, I mean, I've had a lot of of reviews and responses that I've responded to, and responses go all the way, actually, from the wildly enthusiastic through to some people who absolutely hate the book, and it's not surprising. In a sense, I'm proposing a sort of paradigm change, paradigm changes, are never sort of totally one-off things. They're always prepared for. There are always elements leading in that direction that then have to be sort of gathered up, and here you've got a new paradigm. But paradigm changes are not easy to accept, and in a sense I don't think one should accept a paradigm change easily. It should be subject to very, very serious discussion before you take it on. And
is that partially because what you're essentially proposing is what was traditionally believed in the first place, that it is eyewitness testimony and it is kind of fairly authoritative?
Yes, and I think the significance of the book in that sense is that while the conclusions are relatively traditional, the arguments by which I reach them are new. And that, I think, means that no one is justified in saying, well, this is just the old traditional stuff. We know all that. We've dismissed it. We know it's wrong, so we won't bother to read the book. The book doesn't rest on the traditional arguments. It has a whole lot of new angles on the gospel material.
We'll continue talking in just a moment. We're going to take a quick break here. Gentlemen, we've talked already around the issues surrounding the whole area of eyewitnesses and things. Richard, tell us specifically, what conclusions do you draw as to who the primary eyewitnesses in the three synoptic gospels, Matthew, Mark and Luke, who they actually are, and why you think that's the person?
Yes, I mean, the earliest testimony outside the New Testament that we have to the origin of the Gospels comes from a man called Papias, who was a bishop in Asia Minor, modern Turkey, at the beginning of the 2nd century. And he was around at the time when the Gospels were being written. I think it's quite significant, and interested in these issues at the time when the Gospels were being written. And it's Papias who tells us that the Gospel of Mark was written by Mark, who worked as Peter's interpreter. Presumably he translated Peter's Aramaic into Greek or possibly Latin. And it was Mark who recorded Peter's teaching in a gospel. Papias thinks he tended to have individual stories from Peter, and the way they were put together was Mark's work. Now, I think there are all sorts of reasons, actually, for rehabilitating Papias in terms of his evidence on Mark's gospel. And I think it goes very closely with quite a lot of evidence within Mark's gospel that could also lead us in the same direction. So I think Mark's gospel is primarily largely based on the testimony of Peter. And one other point about that is that Mark himself, if he's the John Mark of the New Testament, I think there's a good argument that he is, he himself had been a member of the Jerusalem church, so he'd had a good deal of opportunity himself for meeting the eyewitnesses. So I think the main source from Mark is Peter, the way that Peter used to tell the stories in his public preaching, and Mark may well have thrown in some things he knew as well for himself. Now, I go along with the view of the large majority of gospel scholars that Mark's gospel was used by both Matthew and Luke, and both Matthew and Luke take over a great deal of Mark's material. Usually they abbreviate it somewhat, because I think Matthew and Luke are both interested in writing comprehensive gospels. They want to gather up all the material they can find and squeeze it all into one gospel. So they had other sources as well. Luke, of course, is the most explicit of the evangelists in terms of telling us what he's doing, because Luke actually has a preface of the type that ancient historians would write, and he refers there quite specifically, I think, to his material coming from the eyewitnesses. So we have Mark's gospel, and Luke, I think, would have used Mark's gospel quite happily because he would have seen it as effectively Peter's testimony. Where does his other material come? I think we can't really do more than speculate about that. I think there's some grounds for thinking that some of Luke's traditions actually come from the circle of the women disciples, who are quite prominent in Luke's gospel. And the other feature of Luke's gospel, I think, that's rather interesting, is that whereas for Matthew and Mark, you really get the impression that the disciples of Jesus are the 12. Very few references to other disciples of Jesus. In Luke, he's constantly telling us that great crowds of disciples travelled around with Jesus. There were a lot of other people around, and Luke names a number of these other people. So I think it's actually more likely that Luke has drawn, besides Mark, on material coming from perhaps less well-known eyewitnesses outside the circle of the 12. Matthew is the most puzzling of the Gospels, and I say the least about Matthew of any of the Gospels in the book. Papias connects it with Matthew in a rather contorted way that's quite difficult, I think, to follow. I think Matthew must have had something to do with the Gospel. And, of course, the title Gospel, according to Matthew, doesn't have to mean Matthew wrote it. It can mean that Matthew's, an important figure behind it. I do think the titles of the Gospels must be very early, because if you think about it, as soon as an early Christian community had more than one Gospel, they had to have a way of distinguishing one from another. And we know of no other way in which the Gospels were ever titled. So I think these names attached to the Gospels must go back to the early circulation of the Gospels, when people were in a good position to know what titles should be given to the Gospels. In Matthew's case, I found it very... the reason I don't think Matthew himself could have written the Gospel is not only that does he take over Mark's material very generously, but also when he records his own call as a disciple, if he were Matthew, when he records Matthew's call of a disciple, Matthew's sitting at the receipt of custom, famous story, Jesus comes along and calls him away from his profession as tax collector. Matthew has actually taken over Mark's story. It seems to be very unlikely that Matthew...
The story of Levi.
Indeed, yes. It seems to be very unlikely that the Apostle Matthew would need to depend on Mark for the story of his own call. So that's the one thing that really convinces me that Matthew isn't the author of the Gospel. Right. But I think there's enough ground for thinking that Matthew's somewhere behind the Gospel. That's as far as I can go with Matthew.
Would you by and large agree with, on those synoptic Gospels, Richard's assessment there, James, that we can be fairly confident that the authorship, if not written by the named people, is firmly associated with the names that have traditionally been associated with those Gospels? And obviously, in the case of Mark, Peter, being the principal eyewitness that Mark uses.
I would, but with qualifications, I think. I mean, I have, say, a more agnostic view in many ways. I see the arguments Richard laid out as certainly plausible. With Mark, I'm a little sceptical. I have no firm conclusion on this, but with Mark, there is we've got this Papias, the idea that it was a gospel not in order. There were certain problems with Mark's gospel, so I could see theoretically, I'm not saying this is necessarily true, that it could get attributed to somebody like Mark, who is a sort of flawed character in the New Testament, and by default with Peter in that way, so it gives it both the authority and it can account for the perceived problems with Mark in the early church. Now, I don't say that's the true account of what happened, but it leads me to be just a little sceptical on these things. I'm just more agnostic on the who wrote the Gospels more than anything. That's all.
With Mark, for instance, do you believe there was a single author? I mean, can we be sure of that much, that this was one person pretty much writing?
I don't think we can be sure of that much. I mean, multiple authorship certainly there in early Judaism. So, I mean, it's possible you could have more than one author, but it's also possible you could have a single author. I really don't know is the answer to that.
What makes you confident then, Richard, that it is a single author, more or less writing down the reminiscences of Peter?
I think he was doing a little more than writing down the reminiscences. I think Mark is a real author. He puts together the material. And you see, Mark is doing something which, unless someone had written an account like Mark before Mark, which is possible, but Mark is the first person we know who actually had to put the traditions about Jesus and the sayings of Jesus into a sequence, into a chronological sequence, and tell the whole story of Jesus' ministry and death and resurrection. So Mark has to actually he has to absorb this material into a source, into a sequence. And the way I think Mark has done it actually is really more pedagogical than chronological. In other words, Mark has laid out the material so that we learn by following it. And the easiest point to illustrate this is that the miracles of Jesus in Mark almost entirely confined to the first half of the Gospel, up to Peter's confession. And then Jesus' predictions of the passion, the cross and resurrection, occur from that point onwards. So it's almost as though Mark is laying out the evidence for us as to who Jesus is. And first of all, he has all these deeds of power that impress everybody and convince Peter that he's the Messiah. And then we have to learn that he wasn't necessarily the Messiah in the expected sense. So from that point onwards, Mark is leading up to the cross. Now, and there's more stuff like that. And I think Mark has arranged the material in that sort of way. That's why Papias thought it was not in order, and he meant, I think, not in chronological order. It's not in chronological order, but it is a carefully ordered sequence, which I think must have been done by a single author.
And so you don't have the problem that James does in terms of that not being enough evidence, really, for this being attributable to John Mark. I mean, your point, to some extent, was it, James, that because of the nature of Mark, which has been traditionally seen as a bit possibly haphazard or something, that sort of reflects the character of Mark, and therefore that would be the reason it would be attributed to.
I only raise it as a possibility, just
sure.
that leads to my agnosticism or scepticism about this, that's all. Again, as I say, I could see what Richard's arguing, and I could see it as a plausible explanation. I just can't go the whole way just yet.
It just doesn't compel you.
I say something else about the derivation of it from Peter, because I think, in a sense, one could make a case for derivation from Peter, whoever the author was. And it's remarkable that Peter is so prominent in Mark. I mean, Peter, in proportion to the size, because Mark's the shortest of the Gospels, but in proportion to his size, Peter, who's a prominent character in all the Gospels, but in Mark, he's more prominent than any of the other Gospels, and he's, of course, much the most prominent figure after Jesus. And suppose people are listening to Mark being read or reading it for themselves, and they are alert to who the eyewitness might be. The first of Jesus' disciples to be named in the Gospel is Peter. Really quite emphatically, he's called Simon, of course, at that point, but Simon, repeated in the first reference. And then there is Peter again in the last verse of the Gospel, virtually, the penultimate verse, I think. Again, the angel says, "Go and tell Peter and Jesus' disciples." He needn't have said Peter, he could have just said. So that there's a special prominence of Peter, I think, in this very frequent naming of Peter all the way through the Gospel, and also his naming right at the beginning of the events of the Gospel and right at the end, forming a sort of enclosure around the whole narrative, which I think could lead very easily to, if one is looking for eyewitnesses, Peter is the obvious eyewitness that Mark would be broadly dependent on.
So you'd say, really, the Gospel of Mark is really the Gospel according to Peter. It's just that Mark was the person attributed to having written it down. I mean, perhaps moving beyond the synoptics to the real area where you guys have most disagreement. John's Gospel, I mean, I've always understood this, to be, the first three Gospels sort of tell the history, and then John's Gospel is in a different category where it's really a theological interpretation of Jesus' life and ministry. Now, is that the way you would see it, James? That John sort of is a different type of material to the others.
It's been criticised, that kind of view, obviously, but I think there's some truth in it. The big problems for me with regards to Richard's theory is something, take the raising of Lazarus, for example, as the catalyst for Jesus' death, whereas with synoptics we've got the cleansing of the temple, or some of the very ferocious disputes on Jesus claiming equality with God in John 5, John 10, and why these aren't in the synoptic Gospels. I mean, this is where I start to disagree with Richard's theory, perhaps, but even if let's just assume there was an eyewitness behind John's Gospel, we've still got those problems there. How do we deal with those? It seem to me stark differences between the two Gospels. And then what if all is eyewitness? What does this tell us about the process of eyewitness testimony?
So you believe John basically says quite different things about Jesus to the synoptics. I mean, the Christology that is in John is simply not present, as far as you're concerned, in the the synoptic gospels. They don't have as high a view of Jesus as John.
Certainly not
has.
as vigorously developed. And why does this material not turn up in the synoptics? I mean, presumably, if there were the disputes such as John 5, where it was the Sabbath and the Jews want to stone Jesus because of his claims for equality with God, why do these not turn up? Because it seems these would be very prominent
significant
stories.
episodes. Yeah. Okay. Well, you claim, Richard, that John is actually, ironically, out of the four Gospels, the one that is written, not just an eyewitness account of, but written by the eyewitness.
Yes.
So what's your claim for that?
See, oddly enough, John is the only Gospel that quite explicitly claims to be written by an eyewitness, but for most modern scholars it's the one least likely to be written by an eyewitness. So it's kind of ironic in more than one way, if you like. I think that one should take the statement seriously. And I think that really there are only two possibilities in reading that note at the end of John's Gospel, which says, "This is the disciple who wrote these things." And one possibility is that he really did. The other possibility is that he's falsely claiming to be that disciple. I don't think there's any way of making that statement mean anything else. A lot of modern scholars have wanted to try and take it to mean something less than it actually says. So I think that's really the stark choice. I do think, with James, of course, there is a sense in which John's Gospel is in a category of its own. It's distinctive by comparison with the Synoptics in various ways. But I think one of those ways is that it is a more reflective, a more interpretative Gospel. All the Gospels, of course, have some theological interpretation. This isn't an absolute contrast. And a point I frequently make in the book, actually, is that history is never uninterpreted. Fact and interpretation always go together in history. We can't avoid that. And we should never imagine ourselves getting back behind interpretation to some sort of uninterpreted core. It's not there. So there's interpretation in all the Gospels. But an interesting way of putting this is that if you think about miracle stories again, I think Mark has about 16 miracle stories in a very short Gospel. In a much longer Gospel, John has only 7. And miracle stories are very important in John. He's always talking about the signs, which are the miracles. He tells us these signs so that we may believe, he says at the end. They're very important to John, but he has far fewer of them. And he has far fewer, as it were, episodes than any of the other Gospels. And this, I think, is because he's been deliberately very selective and giving himself the space to expound on these events and to tell the stories at greater length. He's a good storyteller, but also to reflect on the meaning of the events. So I think that's one important difference for John.
With John, how do you? What's the evidence within the texts themselves that you particularly pick up on as being? I mean, he talks a lot about the beloved disciple, and that's traditionally been taken as a self-reference of the author. And you don't feel that sort of can be removed from the person who wrote the Gospel itself. It has to be John.
I think it has to be because the note at the end of the Gospel. And one other thing about my view of John's Gospel is I see it as a very carefully composed, very integrated work, not a sort of process of editing of various sources thrown together rather awkwardly as some people see it. I think it can be shown in kind of literary terms that it's very integrated work. And that means that when the last verse of the Gospel tells us that the beloved disciple wrote the things, then we have to take it to mean the beloved disciple who appears through the Gospel is the author. There's an odd thing, of course, about the anonymity of the beloved disciple, which I don't think anyone's explained fully satisfactorily, and I'm not at all sure I have a final conclusion on that. But I think one thing that the anonymity does is to sort of single out the beloved disciple and put him in a different category from Peter and John and Nathaniel and Nicodemus and the other disciples named in the Gospel. And just one more point that follows from that. If you do look at the other characters in the Gospel, the other disciples of Jesus in John, they are disciples who are not, for the most part, prominent in the Synoptics. So you get people like Nathaniel, who doesn't appear in the Synoptics at all. You get members of the 12 like Philip and Andrew, who in the Synoptics are just in the list of the 12, but you don't hear anything else about them. They're prominent in John. And I think John is a gospel that comes, as it were, from the traditions of the beloved disciple and his circle of disciples of Jesus. So I think the traditions are coming from a different a circle of people from those that fed into Mark's narrative around Peter.
I mean, would John have been aware of Mark's Gospel? Do you think he would have read that and it would have influenced what he wrote, therefore?
Yes, I do think that John does know Mark's Gospel. He doesn't, it seems to me, use it as a source in the way that Matthew and Luke do. He doesn't take over chunks of Mark, except on special occasions I think he may do, but on the whole he doesn't. And he, I think, would have been able to presume that most of his readers would already know Mark. Mark had been circulating around the churches for a while before John wrote. And therefore I think he can take Mark for granted, as it were, and he's doing much more in the way of supplementing Mark. You see, I think if you put Luke, Matthew and John together, they all know Mark, they all use Mark to some extent. What Luke and Matthew are trying to do is to produce comprehensive Gospels that include all of Mark's stuff and a lot of other stuff too. John is writing a very selective Gospel, which takes Mark for granted, thinks you know that, and adds to it. So they're very different approaches to Mark.
Is that satisfactory for you, James, as an explanation of why there may be these fundamental differences that you see between John and the synoptics?
Yes, I mean, I agree that there's something going on strange with the beloved disciple, and the best explanation is that there's an origin of this material with the beloved disciple, whoever the beloved disciple may be. Again, I think there's probably a general awareness of Mark's Gospel behind John, and I think I agree with the model of, this comprehensive model you've mentioned with reference to Luke and Matthew. I mean, I think it's where we probably differ would be where we go with that and John's Gospel. I've got no significant difference, if any, with the general outline that Richard gave.
You mentioned your problems, though, with the fact that episodes that seem so prominent in John and simply aren't touched on in the synoptics. I mean, does that make you think, actually, those things were a later addition? If they happened, they would have been recorded in Mark, at least, the very earliest Testament.
Well, yes. I mean, some of them seem very extremely prominent episodes in John's Gospel, such as a dispute over the very nature of Sabbath, I think, and the hard, full deification of Jesus, and the raising of Lazarus as well, leading to the death of Jesus. These seem to me to be examples. More probably to be creative rewriting. I would take something like the cleansing of the temple to be the more plausible reason for the death of Jesus, which you don't get in John.
I mean, you do pick up on the death of Lazarus, the resurrection of Lazarus. It only happens in John, but surely such a extraordinary event would have been recorded in the synoptics. But you have a particular theory, don't you, Richard, as to why it might not have been mentioned in Mark, etc.
Yes, I think there's probably something that Gerd Tyson suggested, he calls it protective anonymity going on in the Gospel Passion narratives. And it's very interesting if you look at Mark's Gospel, and there's a great sort of cloak and dagger sort of feel to Mark's Gospel as he gets nearer to the arrest of Jesus. And people who are very prominent in that story appear anonymously. In itself, that's not so different from the rest of the Gospel, but one or two cases. The woman who anoints Jesus in Mark's story, Jesus says she will be remembered wherever the Gospel is told. But she hasn't got a name. It's an extraordinary case of not naming someone, I think, and I don't think any of the commentators really have a good explanation of that. Tyson's suggestion is that people like that, the young man who runs away in the Garden of Gethsemane in Mark, people like that are being protected because these stories were being first told in a context in Jerusalem where it would be dangerous to be known as one of those who had aided and abetted a false Messiah. And I think Lazarus could well be put into that category. In fact, John's Gospel actually says, soon after the raising of Lazarus, that the authorities were trying to arrest Lazarus too. So Lazarus was in danger. And
so what you're saying is when the Gospel of John came to be written, that was no longer a going concern.
Exactly.
They could sort of lift the self-imposed, anonymity.
Yes.
How would he have actually known it was Lazarus, though? I mean...
Well, if he was the beloved...
Because he was the witness.
If he was the beloved disciple, he would have known Lazarus. He was in Jerusalem at the same time, yes. So I think, the general sense, I'm not bothered by a more general fact of there being material in John that is not in the synoptics. I mean, there's a lot of material in Luke that's not in Mark. There's material in Matthew that's not in... you've got multiple traditions. Nobody's writing, a complete life of Jesus. They're selecting from the traditions they know, and I think coming from different circles of disciples is one way to explain the different events. I do agree that Lazarus is however a different case, because Lazarus is so important in the way the story develops.
Well, exactly,
in John.
and that's really your fundamental point, isn't it, there, James, that you've got different reasons for Jesus being arrested and ultimately crucified in different Gospels, and so if they both claim to be eyewitness accounts, which one is the correct account? I mean, is that a...
I think so. I mean, and this is where I talk about, the implications of Richard's argument. I mean, if on the one hand, does it mean we have creative rewriting, or does it mean we have something... Does this tell us something about eyewitness testimony itself? You talk about the gist in the book quite a lot, which seems a reasonable argument to me. But also, would something like this, if we took your argument about eyewitness writing in John's Gospel, would that say something different about the nature of eyewitness testimony?
Not quite sure what you mean there.
Well, it seems to me the gist is a bit different in both, if you see what I mean.
Oh, I see what you mean. Yeah. Well, when I use that term gist, I'm really talking about an individual story. Say the story of the healing of Bartimaeus. We would expect someone retelling that story, and I actually have a whole chapter in the book on the psychology of eyewitness memory, which is actually a fresh contribution to this whole thing. I think there's a lot of study by psychologists, a lot of data we now have as to the kinds of things people remember well, how they remember well, and so forth. And it's a normal feature of telling, if there's a story that's important to you, it's happened to you, and you go on telling it to people through you will vary the detail. People do vary details, but the gist is what remains constant. So I think, and I think you only have to set out the synoptic gospels in parallel, where they are where they're talking about the same events, to see that they vary the details but retain the gist. I'm not so sure about, I think, James, you meant the gist of the whole story, as it were, in John being different. Just on that point of what led to Jesus' death, because it's a very significant issue, I think, in the whole story, as it were. I think the thing that happens, of course, is that the synoptics have the cleansing of the temple, the beginning of the week, beginning of Jesus' last week in Jerusalem. He arrives in Jerusalem and cleanses the temple. Whereas John has that right at the beginning of Jesus' public ministry. Now, really that's, if you like, John against Mark, because Luke and Matthew have simply followed Mark. They're not additional witnesses to that. I think that what Mark has done is another way in which Mark is artificial, in a sense, in how he lays out the material. Mark has given everything that happens in Galilee, then he has Jesus travelling to Jerusalem, some things happen on the way, and then Mark has everything that happened in Jerusalem. So in a sense, Mark has an artificial scheme, and he had to put all the things that happened in Jerusalem in his last week, because that's the only place where his Jesus is, in Jerusalem. Now, John, you see, one of the things about John that's very striking, actually, is that John is very precise about chronology and geography. You always know in John pretty closely at what point in the 2-year ministry something happens, because he ties things to the Jewish feasts. You always know pretty definitely where they happen, which is much vaguer very often in the synoptics. John has this precision about history and geography, which makes me actually more inclined to credit John. And I'm not alone in this. I mean, I think quite a few people think that actually, if one's simply looking at general probability, it's much more likely that Jesus went to Jerusalem several times during his ministry than that he didn't go near the place until the last week. But the point I really wanted to make about what led to the death of Jesus is, you see, I think John portrays the cleansing of the temple as the beginning of this process of antagonizing the Jewish authorities in Jerusalem that eventually leads up to Jesus' death. So, in a sense, the cleansing of the temple is a trigger, even in John's narrative. Whereas what Mark does is condense that whole process that John has taking place over several visits to Jerusalem. That antagonism of the authorities to Jesus has to all kind of build up within 1 week. But I think actually they both give the cleansing of the temple an important role in that.
Well, join us again in a couple of moments' time. So, James, does Richard's explanation of the differences between John and the synoptics, particularly Mark, work for you? Giving a plausible reason why it could still be eyewitness testimony, even though it differs significantly from Mark, which, essentially what you're saying is John got it, in terms of historically correct, because Mark wasn't so interested in getting everything in its perfect order. He wanted to put everything that happened in one place together in one bit of the story.
I mean, it stretches out a little bit too much for me, I think. I still think there is a element of a good chronology in Mark's Gospel, especially the idea of a last week in Jerusalem where he does something in the temple and he ends up being crucified. Seems, a fairly obvious run of events to me. It's I agree that the placing of the cleansing of the temple at the beginning of Jesus' ministry in John has this narrative function. But then the Lazarus story, how would you bring that into the death then? Because it does seem to me two stark ways of explaining the death of Jesus in Jerusalem.
Two contradictory ways, is what you're saying.
I would probably have to go that far, yes. I guess Richard wouldn't.
Well, I'm suggesting the cleansing temple is the initial clash with the Jewish authorities, which then builds up over Jesus' visits to Jerusalem. And of course, John has a last week in Jerusalem, but the raising of Lazarus, because you see in John's account, the raising of Lazarus, not surprisingly, has a huge effect on Jesus' popularity with the crowds. So it's kind of the trigger to this very dangerous popularity of Jesus at the end, which you also get reference to in the synoptics. This sense that Jesus was a troublemaker. They've got to do something about him because they have a rebellion on their hands, something like that. So that I think the Lazarus event has that effect in John's narrative, and therefore acts as the sort of final point when they must resolve to really take action. And John, of course, has this meeting of the High Priest's Council after Lazarus' resurrection. Now, the synoptics also have that meeting, but they don't have Lazarus as a kind of trigger for it.
Just time to wrap up, really, as we conclude this section of the programme, with some final thoughts. It's been fascinating going through the various sort of differing points and also the points of agreement between you gentlemen. Ultimately, when it comes to the authorship of the Gospels as a whole, it sounds to me, James, that you're not disinclined to agree with Richard that actually we needn't be as sceptical as some have been in your field in the past, that there might be good reasons that Richard's putting forward here for accepting that actually, yes, that these were eyewitness accounts that have been transmitted reasonably accurately.
Yeah, I may be a little agnostic on issues of authorship of Mark, say, and maybe I don't buy the idea of the authorship of John, but yes, I think the general overall model is a plausible one, particularly with reference to the Synoptic Gospels. I think there's arguments I kind of generally buy, even if I would, be a little sceptical on, absolute precision. But I think it's an important model. I hope people will take it seriously, not just from the conservative wing of scholarship. I know one or two people who aren't from the conservative wing of scholarship who take it seriously, and I think it's moved scholarship forward.
Well, Richard and James will be joining me again next week. My great pleasure this week to welcome back again our two guests from last week, Richard Bauckham and James Crossley. Richard's book, Jesus and the Eyewitnesses, has shaken up the world of biblical criticism as he makes a very strong case for the Gospels being eyewitness testimony. And he even goes so far as to make claims of who those eyewitnesses were. In fact, makes the quite audacious claim in many ways that the Gospel of John, the last book many would consider to be able to nail down as an eyewitness account, as being actually written by an eyewitness, namely John. So a really interesting discussion we were having last week, gentlemen. We sort of got from you your basic thesis, Richard. James, you were concerned on some levels. You agreed with much, but were concerned at particularly Richard's claim that John is an eyewitness account. You feel that John is just very theologized. It's obviously worked out a lot of theology. It feels to you too late to have been written by an eyewitness. Is that the sense?
Wouldn't say
getting
too
from...
late. It seems to me that there's some creative writing up, rewriting, inventing going on with John's Gospel now. Whether that's by a community or whether that's by an eyewitness, the same issue arises. You know, I mean, how reliable is an eyewitness testimony ultimately?
Yeah, and that's perhaps what we need to discuss today, is the whole concept of eyewitness testimony, which is perhaps what we could look into in today's programme. Because, I don't know, when I hear someone talking about eyewitness testimony, I think of a courtroom and someone up on the stand and being asked by a barrister to describe what happened as an eyewitness. And then you'll get another eyewitness come along and they might have a slightly different version of events, and so the jury will be left to decide who was the most trustworthy. Perhaps one of them was under the influence of alcohol when they were describing it or whatever. I mean, and in many ways the book does act as a bit of a detective novel. That's part of the fun of it, I think, Richard, that as you read it you're sort of trying to get behind, well, why would this eyewitness have said this? And whereas the other eyewitness said this, well, maybe this is the reason, you know, and we heard a bit of that last week as well. We were talking about maybe one eyewitness wanted to grant some anonymity to certain people because of the time at which that story was being written down, and they might get into trouble, but someone a later time, and this is your reason for thinking that I know certain characters in the Gospel of John that are given names, who aren't given names in the earlier Gospels. You say that's because John was able to kind of let that cat out of the bag at that point. So really interesting stuff, you know. But why should we, I suppose, ultimately trust the eyewitnesses themselves? I mean, could they have been making it up? Could they have got their stories together, you know, and sort of come up with this story about Jesus and his death and resurrection and that sort of thing? I mean, that might be where a lot of people's minds will naturally go.
Yeah. I mean, I think probably the first important thing to say is that people have asked, well, does it really make any difference if this comes from the eyewitnesses? They could get it wrong too, so does it help? I mean, the thing to say about the eyewitnesses is simply that they were in a position to know. I mean, that's the really important thing about the eyewitnesses. They were in a position to know. And, you know, if you think about how you trust people who witness to things, why do you trust people's testimony? You have to be sure they're in a position to know. You have to have a good idea that they're in a position to know. If they're not in a position to know, you know, that's a real ground for doubt. So at least they were in a position to know. Of course, that doesn't mean that they got everything right, and absolutely no historical argument could ever prove finally that everything that someone says is correct. I did do a lot of work on the psychology of eyewitness memory, and there's a whole lot of scientific studies out there which actually nobody has drawn on before in relation to Gospels, that I think is really very interesting stuff. I found it fascinating. And there is a lot of study that sort of points to the kinds of things that would be remembered well and how it is that people do remember well when they do. And the kinds of things that are remembered well are unusual events. You don't usually remember your regular day-to-day routine. You remember unusual things. Things that really were important to you. Things that were really significant, you remember. Things that emotionally affected you. And some people find that a bit difficult. It seems to be bringing in an element of subjectivity. But I think there is an important element of subjectivity, that actually the things that really affect you are the things that have gone deep enough into you to stay there, you know. So there's the kinds of things that are remembered well. Conversely, things that aren't remembered well are dates. Very, very rarely, unless it's kind of integral to the story, it's something that happened on your birthday, you remember the date. Otherwise, you don't remember dates of things. And you remember the gist rather than the details. And I think everybody retelling stories that are important to them, the details will vary over time and to different audiences and so on, but the gist remains constant.
What do you make of, and this is slightly off at a tangent, so forgive me, but those who do want to harmonise the Gospels,
yes,
and say, well, you've got this account of the resurrection, you've got this account of the resurrection, and there seem to be differences in the details, but you could see that if so-and-so went off here and then so-and-so came, that would make sense of why they saw something different to so-and-so. And some people obviously feel that's important, that if you're going to believe in the Gospels, they have to all be telling exactly the same story. Others say, well, look, these are just different people's accounts.
Yes.
But does that mean that if there is something that, if there is an obvious contradiction, that therefore someone's got it wrong? Does that mean that the Bible is wrong? Is there then a theological implication about that? I mean, where do you kind of land up on this sort of area?
Well, I think there are two things going on. That there are certainly different memories. I mean, I think actually there's no real problem about regarding the 4 accounts of the visit to the empty tomb by the women, which is a story we have all 3 Gospels, of course. I see no reason why these should not go back to different eyewitnesses telling the story slightly differently. I mean, these are, if it happened, it was an extraordinary thing to happen. You know, these women were overwhelmed by it. It's not surprising if they tell it slightly differently. There's also a question of storytelling, and you know, one thing that happens is that John tells the story, and he only has Mary Magdalene. He kind of individualizes it, and that's good storytelling. I mean, if you focus on an individual, it makes much more impact. You're much more affected by a story that's about an individual. You know, this is kind of close relation of Jesus and Mary Magdalene. It makes it a better story. And anyone recounting history in the ancient world had to tell good stories. It's communication. It's not just sort of dry writing down of detail. You know, it's communication. And so there's a sense in which varying the detail or the way you tell it is part of good storytelling. And I think ancient people were quite happy with the idea that stories were told somewhat differently by different storytellers.
But does that mean then stuff was made up?
No, it doesn't. What John has done is to focus on the one woman and left the others out of the picture. Though he does betray the fact that the other women that there, as Mary Magdalene comes back to the apostles and she says, "We found the tomb empty," or whatever. So there's just one point that suggests Mary Magdalene actually had companions. But John has focused the story on Mary.
Which is the rule of good storytelling, of course, that you focus on a character rather than a...
Exactly, and John, I think, is a brilliant storyteller. You know, it's part of the taking longer to tell each story that John does. You know, the story of Lazarus and Martha and Mary goes on a little bit, but you get this real sense of characters and people you're involved with. So John is a skillful storyteller. But that doesn't mean he's untrue to the facts necessarily. You know, an ancient historian had to do both.
I know, James, when we've had these sorts of discussions in the past, you've been open to the idea that there was a penchant for adding and for, if you like, dramatising at the very least, and possibly adding extra things to stories. And I remember there was a bit of a to and fro between you and Michael on the whole thing in the resurrection account, or Jesus' crucifixion of the dead coming out, and you saying, well, isn't that an example of addition to a historical account? So, I mean, where do you stand on eyewitness testimony? Do you think that eyewitnesses were essentially telling just what they had seen, or were they prone to adding, to kind of remembering more than maybe had really happened?
Well, I quite liked Richard's idea of the gist more than is. I think that's the important thing about it. You know, we know it's sort of roughly right, so we don't have to be too worried about slight discrepancies as if this is evidence that it didn't happen and so on and so forth. What I would like to do to Richard's model is inject a little chaos, if you like.
You're always wanting to inject chaos into,
I don't know if you can inject chaos,
neat theories.
And see, more elaborate storytelling, if you like, taking place. Invention perhaps, and this is where we've debated before on the issue of the miraculous. Whereas I think one of the implications of Richard's model is that there are eyewitnesses to miracles. I mean, it has to be in one sense. I mean, and you do here and there, give reference to the incidental details of miracle stories, and that seems to mean, if you accept that is a revolutionary move in terms of the humanities, if you like, or history and so on. I mean, that's where I would like to just see.
So what are you saying? Are you saying then that up to this point you can only be taken seriously as a historian if you have a detached view whereby you say, we all know the miracle didn't take place, but they believed something had taken place, whereas you're saying Richard is saying this is an eyewitness account of a miracle, and therefore it has to be taken as having happened.
I would always qualify by saying I would never judge who gets taken seriously or
Okay.
not. What I would say is it's more about this is a revolutionary move. If you follow the implications through of Richard's model, is you've got eyewitnesses to miracles, and that's a serious issue.
Give us an example of a miracle that is testified to, which you would clearly see as counting as evidence for eyewitness testimony, Richard. I mean...
Oh, I'm sorry. Yes. Well, the thing I did in the book, and I think it was probably a mistake that I didn't explain I was doing this, but I did treat the miracles in the Gospel accounts just on a level with everything else. I didn't make any special issue of them. And that's the way I do it myself. But I quite see that for many people that's an issue, and I should at least do it. The reason I didn't go into it, of course, it becomes, I think, a philosophical issue whether miracles are possible and so on. I mean, it is, of course, a question of what worldview one comes to the evidence with. And I can quite see that if someone has a worldview which excludes the possibility of miracle, then they're already disinclined to be convinced by the evidence which might well convince them of something much more ordinary. There is a question, of course, what counts as a miracle, and I would suspect that, James, would you be quite happy with many of Jesus' healings?
Yes, I would say yes, and exorcisms.
Yes.
I wouldn't define them in terms of miraculous necessarily.
No, I mean,
But you would see that people who witnessed that would have witnessed something which you might see now as being some sort of psychoanalytical thing, but they would have said a miracle.
No, but they might not necessarily. They wouldn't necessarily call it a miracle. I don't know. I mean, that could depend from case to case. But I think we could agree that we could potentially have eyewitness testimony to things like this.
Okay.
Yes, I mean, I think the way they thought of miracle, I mean, they didn't think of miracle as an exception to natural law in the way that we would. I mean, they thought of miracle as a sort of very unusual and therefore arresting and impressive event, which drew your attention to God being at work in some way or other. And so I don't think that we need necessarily impose our distinction between what is and what isn't in accord with the laws of nature. And of course, one of the things about science is that, there are things that people used to think couldn't happen according to scientific understanding, which we can now say how they happened. I mean, science does sometimes end up explaining things that used to be inexplicable. I mean, I think there are a number of things going on here. I mean, one of the things is, it seems to me, that any historian approaches the evidence and the work of a historian with certain assumptions about what the world is like. I mean, for example, there are some historians who are convinced of a sort of economic determinism in history, that really everything that happens can be traced back to economic factors. There's a sort of great man theory of history, in which it's these great individuals who really turn the course of history. I mean, these are presuppositions with which people come to the evidence, and they strongly affect the way people read the evidence. And I think being open to the possibility of exceptional events it is a difference of that kind. It doesn't seem to me it has to be a kind of completely different form of approach. So I would say that all historians have views of the world that affect the way they read the evidence. And of course those views of the world can then be affected by the evidence. And there's probably a sort of interactive thing going on there.
Is part of the problem, James, that you would never think about countenancing the miraculous in other areas of history, which might mention miraculous events, so there may be in pagan, histories, talk of events, but you wouldn't expect people looking into the history of that to think that actually happened just because someone says it happened. And therefore, why should we treat the Gospels differently in that sense, as though they have a special status where we can do history and talk about these things as having miraculously occurred? Is that part of your...
Well, I think so. I mean, if you take Richard's view, then you have to judge everything by that standard. So that's pagan, Jewish, whatever. Those need to be open. I've not actually given an opinion whether I said that miracles should or shouldn't be included in history. I think what I think is it's not just a revolutionary idea in terms of eyewitness testimony and views of form criticism. It's a revolutionary method in terms of this would, if Richard's correct, be direct, very clear evidence of miraculous, or something like the miraculous taking place, and that needs to be pursued. I mean, I know there is the difficult philosophical issue, but we all practice history, and if we're going to include something as dramatic as that, then I think it needs to be fleshed out a little.
Is the consequence of that, James, that weighs against, as it were, against Richard's thesis that this is eyewitness testimony? I mean, if you have stories of the miraculous, for you, does that mean they can't have been written down by eyewitnesses because the eyewitness wouldn't have come away thinking it was a miracle, but it's someone who heard about the story in a slightly different format, then attributes it to being miraculous or something? I mean, are you saying that if you have an eyewitness and they describe something miraculous, they just have to be wrong or mistaken?
No, not necessarily. We do have people who say such things, but it would mean that Richard's model would be is questioned a little then in terms of, not necessarily wrong or anything, just questioned in terms of reliability of eyewitnesses. Did they really see miracles, or what did they see? That kind of thing. I mean, those ideas I think need to be fleshed out as well with Richard's model, because these are significant philosophical issues.
I suppose one that people often come up with is the feeding of the 5,000, etc. Was it really a miracle? Did it actually? People had brought some along with them, and they shared it amongst each other and everything. And I mean. But the eyewitnesses, the disciples or whoever passed it on to the people who wrote down the Gospels, said a miracle took place because we only had these many loaves and fishes, and by the time we were finished, we were gathering up baskets of the stuff. I mean, is that where you see maybe the problem being, James, that an eyewitness may think they saw something, but in fact there might have been another explanation?
Well, I mean, no, I mean. Yes and no, in one sense. This is what I'd say. What is the gist of that story? Then, what is the what is it getting at? That was happening in the life and teaching of Jesus. I mean, what my own explanation would probably be, I guess, if I was to write something on this in detail, that it's a piece of creative Jewish storytelling of the sort we find in other texts. That seems to me a perfectly reasonable way of explaining why we get stories such as the miracle stories. Now, I might be wrong, of course, and happy to be proven wrong, but it's really questioning Richard's theory. Could you have the creative storytelling as well as the eyewitness testimony? Or if not, what is the gist of something like a feeding miracle?
Yes, I mean, I don't think some kind of creative storytelling can be completely ruled out. But I mean, one of the things I think about this is that it's a question of trusting your witnesses, and it seems to me that basic to historical method is that we consider whether a witness is trustworthy. And having decided that there's good reason to think the witness trustworthy, we then have to actually trust the witness, So sometimes this may mean saying that, something really rather unlikely, we've got to take their word for it because they were right about everything else, so we trust them in general. I mean, this is part of my whole issue of methodology in the book, is that what I don't think we can do is take the gospel events, one story by one story, one at a time, one saying of Jesus, and sort of weigh up the probability of each one of them one by one. I mean, the form critical thing required you to do that because that's how they thought they came to the evangelists. Just, they'd all come through community oral transmission. And that's how the Jesus Seminar does it. They vote on each event and give it a rating, as it were. I think normal historical method is that you go for the general reliability of your sources. And so we've just got to think about whether Mark is generally a trustworthy witness. There may be special reasons for doubting, this or that within Mark, but on the whole, I think we've got to kind of go for trustworthy sources, and having decided they're trustworthy, go along with them, give them the benefit of the doubt in difficult cases. I think that all kinds of very odd things happen in the world, and there are events in modern history for which it's very good testimony, but I have no idea what was really happening. Fatima in Spain, where hundreds of people saw an appearance of the Virgin Mary, and incredible testimonies to it. And I'm not inclined to think that the Virgin Mary appeared to all these people, but something happened, and I'm not going to, I have no way of explaining it away. So it seems to be a historian can very often if they feel inclined, say something odd happened. We don't know what it was, but something odd happened. What the historian is not obliged to do is to explain everything. Why should we think we know how this or that happened all the time? You know, we're just dealing with the evidence, and the evidence may just point to something extraordinary that we don't know what to do with. And in the case of the Gospels, I think this is the case with regard to the resurrection, you know, which is the important miracle. You know, if we believe that Jesus healed and exorcised, as virtually everyone does, but didn't still the storm or feed the 5,000, I mean, that doesn't make a huge difference to our reading of the story of the Gospels. The resurrection does. The resurrection is the extraordinary thing. And of course, Christians have never wanted to say the resurrection is just another miracle. It's quite exceptional miracle. It's something extraordinary happening to Jesus, comparable only with the resurrection of everybody else at the end of history, which hasn't happened yet, you know. So I think the resurrection is in a remarkable category. It's an exceptional event on any terms, both because of what Christians said about it and also because of the role that it plays in the actual beginning of the Christian movement. The resurrection is exceptional. To accept what the early Christians said it meant, of course, you've got to buy into the early Christian worldview. I take that, and if you come with different worldviews, your attitude to the evidence is going to be different. I think if I were not a Christian, I'd have to say something extraordinary happened and I don't know what it was. It doesn't seem to me that it's susceptible to other explanations. So I think all I'm saying is that all historians, faced with these kinds of witness to things that can't be easily explained, need a bit of humility.
It's an interesting facet of the resurrection accounts that when it comes to eyewitness, women are the primary eyewitnesses in every account. I mean, that a lot has been made of that, you know, as being, you know, in an ironic way, a great supporter of the case for the resurrection, in as much as at the time they'd been wanting to make a case for something that was not true. They wouldn't have chosen to make women their primary, if you like, defendants of it. I mean, how much does the issue of women's testimony come into Jesus and the eyewitnesses? Do you put that in a special category in terms of where, if they were setting down things that women were saying, would they have had in their mind at the time, oh, people aren't going to believe this if I say that Mary said it, or that sort of thing? I
mean, you know, actually, the pagan critic of Christianity, Celsus, in the 2nd century. I mean, we only have excerpts of what he said in Origen's reply to him, but he's the first pagan critic that we have of Christianity, and he says at one point, you know, you're asking us to believe what a hysterical woman said, and there was, I think, this general suspicion of women, especially in religious matters, that they were gullible. So I think I'm less inclined to make a lot of the idea of whether women's witness counted in court in a Jewish context. I mean, some people make a lot of that. I'm not sure that is as relevant as the general sense that women were gullible and unreliable in religious matters, and also that women ought not to be the recipients of revelation. You know, the whole idea of, you know, the role of men in the Jewish tradition, you know, that women are not the recipients of revelation, which is why, you know, in Luke, the women come to the apostles and the apostles don't believe them. They think it's nonsense. You know, the 2 disciples on the way to Emmaus, it's just an idle tale that these women told. You know, they just dismiss it. So the Gospels are quite explicit about, you know, this is not good evidence. So I think that is an odd fact of the evidence, that such an important role is given to the women.
What do you make then of all this, James? Because does this ultimately pose a serious problem for Richard's theory? Because ultimately his key eyewitnesses are all basically pointing to one, you know, event, which, on your understanding, can't have happened in the way that they relate it happening. There must have been another explanation, or it was, you know, could be seen in some other light, presumably. where do you go with that?
Well, I wouldn't put it in such stark terms. I have a kind of methodological indifference about certain things, and when it comes to the reality behind the resurrection, say, then I'm really not fussed at all in one sense. I mean, I think Richard said it, I've said it on this programme. We know something happened. We know that there were witnesses to something or other happening, and I mean, this is where I disagreed with Michael Bird last time. He seemed to me to be insistent on trying to prove it really happened, when I said, well, why don't we just agree that something dramatic happened, and it was important for Christian origins and what happened next and so on and so forth. And there were certainly witnesses, eyewitnesses, people had these visions. We can all agree on that, and we can move on. I mean, we can take their testimony at first hand as well. You know, we think, you know, Jesus was raised and so on. Great. That can help us in historical explanation. I don't think there's much of a tension here.
Does it mean that we haven't got reliable eyewitnesses, though? I mean, is that what it means if people are claiming that this stuff happened?
No, not necessarily. I mean, it depends. I would want to discuss the resurrection stories again in terms of something like storytelling or something like that. It could be viewed in those terms potentially. In terms of just the resurrection appearances. I wouldn't. I think it's as stronger a piece of evidence for eyewitness testimony we've probably got in the New Testament, and we have to say it's reliable. They saw something. They believed this to be the case. I think I don't see a problem.
I mean, I'm wondering sort of how much after the actual events, Richard, would a lot of this stuff have been put down, if you like, because if you asked me now to write an account, I was trying to do it the other day, actually, with my wife. We were trying to think back to the birth of our first child, and we thought we're going to kind of not remember all the details if we don't write it down now, because they kind of just fade a bit more. And so we were desperately trying to think about, and then that happened, didn't it? And then that happened. But the fact is, you know, if you asked me in 10 years, I'd probably have less idea. So in that sense, the detail does tend to fade over time, presumably. What would have, but yet we do seem to have a lot of detail in some of these Gospels, down to quite individual things. Now, was there some way in which that was being kept fresh in the minds of the eyewitness? Was it because they were recounting it on a regular basis? Or?
Yes, I think the basic point is that the eyewitnesses would be constantly telling these stories, and the psychological data I was talking about earlier. I mean, one of the things that makes for good memory is to be repeating. If you're suddenly asked to think of something that happened 20 years ago and you've never thought about it in the interim, you'd have trouble. But frequent repetition aids memory. There is, of course, a difference with the ancient world in that nobody did what you just suggested. I mean, nobody actually would write down for their own use something they wanted to remember. They would simply rely on their memory. And it's not that people had better memories, but they were trained to use their memories because they had to rely on them in a way that we don't. So there was a sort of cultural element there as well. Yes, I think... some of the psychological stuff is actually very disturbing if you think about court cases, because what's happening in court cases is actually very different. Very often what you're requiring of a witness in a court is for them to tell you about something they weren't particularly interested in when it happened, some detail, something they weren't really observing. No. There's no reason to remember it or even really to take much notice of it. What colour was that car? They weren't interested. And that's why an event that's really involving is much better remembered than some incidental thing that you weren't interested in.
Is there a case for saying that the more detail there is in a story, the more we can assume that the storyteller is an eyewitness of that particular story? So if in the Gospel of Mark, it happens to mention that Jesus lay down on a pillow in the back of the boat, I mean, it's a kind of an extra detail. Does that show, therefore, that I
think one has to be very careful about this. I think there's a sort of vividness that a good storyteller can conjure up by means of details. I think the most interesting cases are where a detail doesn't really seem to contribute to the story, and one might sometimes. I think that the healing of the blind man, where Jesus, if you remember the story, he heals the man, and the man says, "I see people walking like trees." and then Jesus does something else and he gets his sight back. You know, but this is obviously a sort of stage of getting his sight back where, you know, I see people. That's a very odd thing. It doesn't fit the usual genre of a miracle story. It's none of the sort of standard elements in a miracle story. I think that's just somebody remembered that, and it was such an odd thing to say. It really stuck in their memory. So I think there are cases where it looks very likely that some detail is something that's sort of stuck in the memory.
But you're always willing, Richard, to give people the benefit of the doubt in that sense, to have the best reading for the idea that it's an eyewitness account. I mean, I could imagine, James, that you would go down the line more of there was a sense in which stories became embellished or were added onto and things arose as stories circulated around, which is kind of in contradiction to what Richard is saying. I mean, is that where you feel a lot of these claims of the miraculous have come from in the Gospels? Is creative, as you've called it, creative storytelling, where people have sort of wanted to add a bit to something to make it that little bit more special?
Well, I mean, I think in many cases that would be a perfectly plausible explanation. If I were ever to write on this, is probably, I would imagine, the kind of conclusion I'd come to, and so on. The interesting thing was, though, is Richard liked the general reliability and against the case-by-case basis to some degree. Where the interesting thing is, when working on case-by-case basis, I felt there was quite a lot of material that I thought, theoretically would go back to historical Jesus, and then I found Richard's model useful. Because as a kind of support for that, so I wouldn't want to actually rule it out so much yet. The other question I want to ask Richard, I can't remember if you touch on this in your book or not, and it's one that's been brought up here, is written testimony. And I mean, if you use the analogy of courts, things get written down, of course. And I'm a bit worried about oral tradition a lot of the time myself. It sounds very romantic and things. I mean, would you have any objection to the idea of material being written down very early as well to preserve it, not just telling each other all the time, which I'm sure is true, but Dead Sea Scrolls, right? Everyone writes things.
Yes, I think it's perfectly possible. I do have a little bit of discussion of that in the book, and I think it's perfectly possible. I don't really see much way of getting beyond saying it's perfectly possible.
Yeah, sure.
It happened. Yeah. It's very difficult. I mean, I think in this discussion of how things were transmitted, there's a danger of getting away from my basic point, which is I think the evangelists had it in many cases from the eyewitnesses, or certainly not far. So I mean, I think one is dealing with a different situation. If you're talking about something as the form critics did, which is passed down, through many transmissions before it gets to the evangelists, and the situation with the close contact with the eyewitnesses, I think that does make a difference. None of this is foolproof. People improve their own stories. This does happen. I'm not, in any case, arguing for precise detail in every case, but in terms of general reliability, it seems to me it makes a difference if you're close to the eyewitnesses.
And you think people, in any case, were more reliable in their memory than they are now, in fact, when we rely on all sorts of other things to retain our thoughts and memories. Back then, when people were really relying on their
I do
own
think that.
memory.
And you see, when Paul talks about oral transmission, I mean, Paul says to the in Corinthians again, he's talking about how, and he has the tradition of the institution of the Last Supper. It's one rare case where Paul actually tells a little story from the gospel tradition, and he said. He says, I transmitted to you as I received it from the apostles, is the assumption. Now, that's the language of formal transmission of traditions, which happened, of course, among the Pharisees, standard part of Jewish culture, that traditions were handed over. And it means a formal process of learning and transmitting. It doesn't mean you just hear the story and then you try and remember it a week later. It means you make an effort to fix it in your mind. You learn it. And the other thing about much of the stuff in the Gospels when it comes to Jesus' sayings is that the sayings are formulated in memorable form. And I think that's quite deliberate. Jesus' teaching as we have it is sayings that were formulated to be remembered.
Now, are you saying in that Jesus, when he first pronounced them, said them in a way that was memorable,
yes,
so that his disciples would remember them? Or
yes,
you're just saying they reformulated what he had said in a memorable way to pass on.
No, I think they are carefully crafted sayings. Jesus was a Jewish teacher, and this was done in the Jewish tradition. You carefully crafted your sayings. So, all these little aphorisms in the Gospels, the one who loses his life will save it, and the one who saves his life will lose it. It's formulated in this neat epigrammatic style that you remember.
What about bits of dialogue, though? Obviously with sayings which he might have repeated again and again to crowds in his preaching. I mean, but conversations just one-on-one with a disciple in one situation. I mean, is it likely, that those have been transmitted in, if you'd stood there with a dictaphone, you would have had the same as John later came up with,
I think it depends whether they're just part of the story. I mean, when Jesus, in the feeding of the 5,000, to go back to that, asked the disciples, what have we got? And they say, I mean, that's just a bit of how you tell the story. Whether Jesus said those words or different words, has no importance, really. So I think there are bits of dialogue that are simply part of the story and which are, detail rather than gist.
Yeah, I suppose it's because when it does come to the theological use of this stuff, many a minister or something will maybe plant a whole sermon on a particular sentence Jesus said in some way, and he may not have said it in quite that way. It was the way that the evangelist put it down. Does it make a difference in that sense?
It depends what you hang on it. I mean, another thing that preachers do is to retell a gospel story, adding bits here and there to bring it to life for the congregation. That's a quite reasonable thing to do, to make us, in a way, it's what people in the ancient world did. They told it so as to bring it to life. It's storytelling as well as fact. I mean, the two go hand in hand.
I mean, coming back to you, James, as another guest I had on this show put it, you may think, of the stories being embellished in a rather Chinese Whispers style way. The only thing is, what's fun about Chinese Whispers is you have the original person who said the phrase in the room so that you can laugh at how it's changed because you can check back with the original person. Now, isn't what Richard's saying that there wouldn't have been this changing and embellishing because you have the original eyewitness to check it up against, who can say, no, that actually happened this way, so that, I mean, isn't that the whole point of the book, really, that this creative storytelling there was a cap on it, if you like, because there were eyewitnesses around to say, actually, it happened this way?
Yes and no. I mean, it depends on your notion of truth here in some ways. If, had our concept of truth, we might think in those terms. But there is the possibility that people had no problem with creative storytelling. It wasn't necessarily a bad thing to do things like this. And, there's the work of one of my favourites, Roger House, he reads a lot of the Haggadic Jewish storytelling material and sees what he can find in the Gospels, particularly about this. And he, talks about it in terms of religious truth all the time, and he doesn't have a problem with it. He says and gives various examples where Jewish figures had no problem with the idea of creative rewriting. So I mean, I could see theoretically there being no problem with this among Christian groups. Maybe some did, maybe some wanted to check, maybe some were perfectly comfortable with the idea of writing up these stories in different ways. So that's what I mean by chaos in a way. In some ways, I think you can have. I don't think it's an either or. I think it's potentially both and.
Do you see the same thing, Richard, there?
I think some of this comes down to an issue of genre, literary genre, and I buy into the view that the Gospels would have been seen by their first readers and hearers as biographies in the ancient sense of the bios, the life of a great person. And I think with the contemporary biography, that is, the biography written within living memory of the person, there would have been an expectation of eyewitness testimony to substantial truth. And I think that's probably where I would distinguish the Gospels from, for example, the retellings of Old Testament stories, of which we have a huge amount in Jewish literature, where the stories are treated quite freely and details added, and sometimes they just get their imagination working on the Old Testament stories. I think the question of literary genre Because that's the importance of genre. You know how to read something because you identify it as this sort of literature. You don't read a historical novel as history because you know it's a historical novel. You identify the genre correctly. When T.S. Eliot puts a poem into the mouths of the Magi, the wise men, you don't think he's seriously giving us, a bit of history. It's a poem. So identifying genre is absolutely crucial, and I do think the argument. Richard Dawkins' argument has been very widely accepted, actually, that the Gospels are in that category of biographical literature is important.
But they are also theological, aren't they?
Yes.
And so would there have been a capacity, and I'm guessing this is where you're saying, James, that for them to invent things for the sake of the theological argument they're progressing, so to, I don't know, in perhaps the triumphal entry into Jerusalem, they want to make it very clear that this is fulfilling a prophecies in the Old Testament, and so maybe Jesus wasn't actually riding on a donkey. That's what they've given him in this instance, because they really want to drive the point home, and they weren't as subject to the rigours of what counts as historical truth as we are today. I mean, that might be where, someone might say that's the way they were in the ancient world. They weren't as concerned with making sure every detail was perfectly true.
Well, I don't think they were as concerned with getting every detail exactly true. And that's my point about storytelling. You have license to vary the detail, but retain the gist. But that's what I think ancient readers expected in terms of faithfulness to the history. They expected a story that tells the gist of what happens, even if the details may be varied, in order to communicate, in order to tell a story. But you see, I think John is very interesting on this, because when John tells the story of the triumphal entry, he says the disciples didn't know what was happening. They realised afterwards. And that's what the psychology, the studies of psychological data on eyewitness memory call deferred meaning. That sometimes, in retrospect, you see what something meant, which you didn't at the time. But John, I think, is making, therefore, a careful distinction between what actually happened and the significance that was later seen in it. And I think you can see that also in John's Gospel, where he tells the same stories as the synoptics, but he finds much more symbolic meaning in them. And if that's the model for what he's doing with stories that we don't have in the synoptics, I think it implies that John doesn't invent events. He tells the events. He sees new meaning in them. He's very into the symbolic value of the events, but he doesn't invent the events for the sake of the symbolic value. He knows the events first, and then he gets his theological ingenuity to work on the symbolism that's going on.
Well, fascinating stuff. Before we go any further, just tell us, you kind of make a comparison in your book between more recent testimony of the Holocaust, eyewitness testimony to the Holocaust. What's the comparison you're making with that?
I think it's a very interesting comparison. One thing about it, of course, is we have loads of testimonies of survivors of the Holocaust, and because we're just about at the point where very few of them left, there has actually been a really serious effort, quite recently to record all these testimonies. I think it's rather like the Gospels being written at the point where the eyewitnesses are getting to be rather thin on the ground. So you get it down in writing. It's important. But the more substantial comparison I make is between exceptional events, where if we didn't have, in the case of the Holocaust, if we didn't have the testimony of people who were actually there in the death camps, we wouldn't really know what the experience was like or what went on. We would know a lot of external facts. They built these, and all that sort of stuff. But we depend on the people who experienced it to know what was really going on. Significance and how it felt like and all that sort of stuff. And this, I think, verifies the idea that testimony from involved participants in exceptional events is actually not a liability but an advantage, and it's actually what you need in the case of exceptional events. If we didn't have the testimony, the things that went on in the Holocaust, none of us would be inclined to believe. I mean, we wouldn't be inclined to believe that people could actually perpetrate such extraordinary evil and work in those ways, unless we had the testimonies to tell us. So the testimony of those who were at the receiving end is actually indispensable for understanding the Holocaust. So I think this preference of ancient historians for involved participants is a very important historical principle, which a certain attitude to history in the modern period, which says what we actually need is the observation of disengaged, dispassionate observers. Well, disengaged, dispassionate observers don't actually get to the heart of what's going on. It's the involved participants who do.
And in that sense, a lot of people have... I've almost felt that sometimes the only things that some historians are going to take as verifiable in the New Testament documents, in the Gospels especially, are things that are verified by outside sources, by Josephus and Tacitus, and
Yes, and there's a terrible danger in history of reducing history to the scope of a modern historian's experience. We're testing everything by what we find credible and what's part of our own experience. I mean, we all have incredibly limited experience, and historians who spend most of their lives in their studies have less experience than most people. So this criterion of the historian's own knowledge of the world is actually a very limiting one. I don't think we should be constrained by that.
I mean, do you see that as well, James? That as much as obviously, I'm sure you do see the Gospels as being partisan in terms of the people who wrote them believed the things had happened. I mean, you can't get away from that, can you? In terms of actually getting to the heart of a story, it's going to be told by the people who were most involved with it, I suppose.
Oh, sure. I mean, I agree with all that, really. I mean, I'm not sure too much what I could add. Absolutely, we should, it's not thinking of our own experiences as some kind of guiding principle. On the other hand, I do think there is a danger of trying to think how they think sometimes. New Testament scholarship, I think one of the worst examples, people like Bruce Molina and the Context Group, who generalise about the Mediterranean, the Arab world, in a way to get away from subjectivity, and I think it's had disastrous results. So you've got to be careful on that side of it as well. But I totally agree with Richard's points on that.
I mean, coming back just briefly then, as we come to the end, your main concern in this area has been what does Richard's thesis do when it comes to if we're claiming that this is eyewitness testimony of the miraculous? I mean, does this... so when Richard makes the claim that people were being eyewitness to miraculous events, do you immediately have to bat that out of hand? Is that kind of... I mean, I just want to be clear as to whether that invalidates in some sense the testimony, if you just say that, well, we have to take eyewitness testimony with a pinch of salt. I'm not sure where you finally kind of find yourself when it comes to... You seem to be quite persuaded by the idea that the Gospels are based on eyewitness testimony. I'm just not sure where you actually stand on the reliability of that eyewitness testimony. Well, people just duped into thinking something that...
Well, I guess that's theoretically possible, but that's not really what I'm getting at there. What I like about Richard's model, it works for a lot of the gospel material.
But only stuff that's not miraculous?
Well, I mean, I haven't really gone into the historicity of the miraculous, and I'll probably avoid it for the rest of my life. But what I'm trying to do is actually provoke Richard into the discussion rather than myself. So how is his model going to explain this? See, I don't feel obliged to explain it in one sense because I don't feel the need, and also maybe to even push him a bit on bringing a bit more of a chaotic model in there, to say that there are other things going on as well. But I mean, what we shouldn't forget in a debate like this is, I don't buy anyone's work 100%, I never do. But you look for the big points and you look for the big persuasive issues, and that's the important thing, I think. The other stuff is me trying to...
I mean, is your ultimate point that we just can't know what was going on when Peter or whoever reports a miracle. If he did, we can't know what the circumstances were of that, and it's the kind of issue where, I mean, and it stands as distinctively different to him reporting the crucifixion or something like that because of the nature of what he's reporting. I mean,
yeah, there is that. I think you've got to take that on board in one sense, because I mean, the miraculous are by definition dramatic events, and this is doing something staggering in one sense if we push the model that hard.
And so we've got to treat the testimony of those events as differently to testimony of what we can. Well, if
they are testimony, we don't know. I'm not sure if we should be calling it testimony necessarily. This is why I bring in other ideas about rewriting, storytelling, that kind of thing. More creative storytelling. So I wouldn't necessarily call that testimony. I would just call it creative writing or something like this. I don't know. That's that kind of thing. I think we also need to bring in to the model of the gospel tradition.
But for you, the creative aspect of the eyewitness testimony is not as prominent as James appears to be saying, Richard.
No, I don't think so. And it'd be quite hard to read 1 Corinthians 15 as a creative account. I think Paul is just boldly listing the people who were known to have experienced this. I do think, I mean, to take a slightly broader view, if what I were doing was to, as it were, validate a Christian understanding of Christian origins, I would not want to isolate the resurrection from a whole complex of things. And, in the end, I believe in the resurrection, both because there is pretty good evidence of it, but also because I can make sense of it in terms of my general understanding of God and the world and who Jesus Christ was and so forth. And it makes sense as what God would do coming from that perspective. I mean, I don't think one could believe in the resurrection as the early Christians did without expecting the resurrection of everyone else at the consummation of history, because the two were entailed by early Christian theology, so that accepting the resurrection entails other religious convictions, and I would prefer to kind of explore the complex of beliefs and claims, among which was something that I think a great many historians like James would admit something extraordinary happened. I suppose defining what it was that happened becomes more important if one is led to that by one being generally impressed by the story of Jesus and so forth, in the way that Christian believers are.
But finally, gentlemen, I think there's been an awful lot you've agreed on. There have been aspects, obviously, you've disagreed on in the last 2 weeks as we've looked at these issues. It's possibly not surprising that your book has been warmly welcomed by the evangelical, if you like, wing of the church, Richard, because essentially it does consolidate, it does, as you said before, with different arguments, consolidate a conservative view of Scripture. And when you said you've had a lot of response to the book, when people have responded negatively, has it been because they think your arguments are bad, or is there some element to which people don't like the idea that you're towing a conservative line, that they don't like a return to some kind of...
There is that, and I think in a way there's a difference of situation in America from Britain, which I've often noticed. I mean, the difference between conservative approaches and more liberal approaches is very polemical in America. And I think it's partly because New Testament scholarship goes on over such a wide range of institutions, and very often the institutions in which it happens are kind of identified or identify themselves as conservative, liberal, and so forth. I do think the world of New Testament scholarship in Britain is very different in a way that I certainly prefer, which is that we all know each other and meet and talk about these things, and go to the same conferences and and have a respect for each other, and therefore I think listen more carefully to each other's points of view than you do in this highly polemical situation where you're disinclined to take something seriously simply because of the camp that it comes from or the views you're associating with it and so forth. I think we do have an advantage in Britain in this respect in having a much more sort of collegial body of biblical scholars who take each other seriously.
Do you think this is changing then? I mean, is this this book, has it sort of changed the direction of scholarship? I mean, is that too grand? It'll sound like you're blowing your own trumpet if you say yes, but in the sense, you know, there are some significant quotes on the back, you know, N.T. Wright, James Dunn, others who, you know, Choice saying it will be hard to take seriously future works of the origins of the Gospels that have not interacted with Bauckham. I mean, do you think that this is, if you like, the direction of scholarship now? Do you think form criticism is a thing of the past, or is this just another kind of book in the kind of the toing and froing?
Yes, I mean, I hope it is. I think the phenomenon which is not unexpected is that younger scholars are much more ready to take this on board than scholars who have worked their whole career with a different paradigm. And frankly, I wouldn't expect someone to easily change a paradigm that they've worked with all their careers, you know. And I do think that a new paradigm needs to be subjected to serious criticism. You know, it needs to be tested. It shouldn't be too easily lapped up, you know. I also think it's a book with a whole lot of ideas in it, and it wouldn't at all surprise me if some of those ideas fared better than others in the long run. But I would hope that in terms of a general direction, it may, as it were, reorientate the way people approach gospel scholarship.
James, thank you very much for being on the programme as well. For you, in terms of the way that you see scholarship going, do you think Richard's onto a winner here as far as this is the new paradigm? Yeah. We've been talking about a paradigm shift, and do you think this is the new paradigm when it comes to looking at the early Christianity in the Gospels?
Well, I mean, first of all, I really don't like to predict futures, because especially if it's recorded. It's interesting. I think Richard's right in terms of the age issue. Time will tell, in one sense, when we get a generation of people coming through and becoming the main scholars in biblical studies. That will be when the testing point for this, I think, in many ways. My concern is, and this is my concern for scholarship in general at the moment, is that I think it's heavily polarised in a way it's not been. I mentioned it earlier. Between a kind, especially the American context. I mean, if you think of the cultural context in America, where Dawkins and co are very much more prominent there than they are here, and as is the kind of hard evangelical reaction, it is very different, and that's reflected in a lot of scholarship. I think what we're going to see soon is this Jesus project as well, where there are people on board who think Jesus didn't exist. I mean, this is coming, I think, in one sense, even if, you know, the majority of people somewhere in between would never associate that. So I think, as far as a paradigm goes, I don't know if scholarship is going that way anymore. The days of Bultmann dominating, I think, are gone. Things are much more diverse, for good or bad. If you look at historical Jesus scholarship, there's just no consensus in so many areas. You know, people are so persuaded, and you can pretty much pigeonhole people by their religious beliefs quite easily in historical Jesus scholarship. So I think there certainly will be people taking this on board, including myself and others. But I think the way that kind of some hard views are embedded in scholarship at the moment will not necessarily mean it's going to be taken on by everybody, as we've seen in some of the broad range of responses, I think, to the book. So, I mean, maybe that's not necessarily a bad thing if we don't all agree. But, I think it'll depend on cultural context in many, many ways.
My thanks once again to my guests who joined me this week and last to look at this fascinating book, Jesus and the Eyewitnesses.